This is the story of one of the most dangerous prisons in Russia, a frozen hell where the cold itself could kill you, and from which no prisoner had ever returned alive. The story begins during the time of the Soviet Union, when Soviet forces invaded Poland. They captured countless Polish citizens, imprisoning them in order to extract information through interrogation. Poland's government had already been completely crushed and destroyed, so there was no one left to help these helpless civilians. The Soviet authorities had become brutally ruthless in their mission to establish control. In fact, they did not even spare children. Cruelty had become their method of rule. Among the captured Polish citizens was a man named Jan, a soldier by profession. As soon as the Soviet officers learned that he was a soldier, they separated him from the rest and began interrogating him more aggressively. They wanted only one thing: for him to confess that he was a spy sent to gather secret information against them. But Jan stood firm from the very beginning. He insisted that he had come there simply to live, not to spy. When Jan refused to confess, the officer called a woman into the room. He asked her whether Jan was her husband. It was soon revealed that she was indeed Jan's wife, brought there against her will. Both confirmed that they were husband and wife. However, the officer then turned to her and asked what else she knew about Jan. To Jan's shock, his wife declared that he was a spy working on a secret mission. Jan was stunned. He could not believe what he was hearing. He was only a normal soldier. He had never been involved in any secret espionage. But in that moment, he understood the painful truth. The Soviets must have forced her to say those words. She likely had no other choice. She was speaking exactly what the officers wanted to hear. Satisfied with this forced confession, the officers concluded that Jan was guilty. And in their system, the punishment for espionage was severe. Jan was sentenced to 25 years in prison, not in an ordinary prison, but in the most feared and brutal prison the Soviets possessed. A place so terrifying that criminals trembled even at the mention of its name. Many would rather die on the spot than be sent there. Soon after the sentence was confirmed, Jan was transferred along with several other prisoners to that frozen nightmare of a prison. The location was isolated in a vast, snow-covered wilderness. As the camera reveals the prison, it is surrounded entirely by endless white snowfields stretching beyond the horizon. Nothing else can be seen. The temperature drops to terrifying levels, especially at night, plunging far below zero. The Soviet soldiers proudly claimed that no prisoner had ever escaped alive. Even if someone tried to run, the infinite stretch of snow and the deadly cold would ensure their death. Survival was nearly impossible. Just imagining escape was foolish. When the prisoners arrived, a general addressed them directly. He gave them strict instructions: never attempt to escape. If any prisoner somehow managed to cross the prison boundaries, the civilians living beyond would kill them anyway. The Soviet government had placed heavy rewards on every escaped prisoner's head. For that amount of money, ordinary citizens would not hesitate to turn into hunters. In a way, even the civilians were working for the regime. On the very first day, fear was planted deep into the prisoners' minds. The message was clear: there was no way out. Later, the prisoners were given their first meal. One by one, they stepped forward to collect their food. Among them was an elderly man. As he picked up his portion, a small piece of bread fell to the ground. Immediately, another old prisoner standing behind him lunged toward that fallen piece, desperate for even a crumb. But the first old man quickly stepped on it and snatched it back for himself. It was obvious. In this prison, no one would give up even the smallest share of food. Survival here meant selfishness. Even among the weak and elderly, mercy did not exist. And this was only the beginning of Jan's nightmare. Jan stood to the side and watched everything unfold. He could not accept the idea that the second old man would remain hungry. The poor man looked weak and exhausted, barely able to stand. Without hesitation, Jan stepped forward and gave his own portion of food to him. The first old man immediately warned Jan. He said, "Do you not want to survive? If you give away your food, you won't last long in here." But Jan calmly replied that the man needed it more, and he could not ignore that. The old prisoner shook his head and said that he himself would survive because he would eat his full share. But Jan, after giving his away, might not make it much longer. Just then, another prisoner approached Jan. His name was John. The two began talking. John asked Jan what crime had brought him to this frozen hell. Jan told him everything: how he had been falsely accused of being a spy and sentenced to 25 years. John responded that he had been given a 10-year sentence, simply for acting. He had performed a role on stage that mocked certain wealthy and powerful men, and for that ridiculous reason, he had been thrown into prison. After a long pause, Jan finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "Has anyone ever tried to escape from here?" John immediately shut the idea down. He told him escape was impossible, and that he should never even think about it. Attempting to flee would only get him killed. Soon, The prison interior was shown more clearly. It was filled with criminals of all kinds, from different countries, but not all of them were true criminals. Some were simply political enemies of the Soviet Union, imprisoned because they opposed the regime. The place was a collection of the unwanted, dangerous men, rebels, and those who had simply spoken the wrong words. Later, John quietly took Jan aside and revealed something unexpected. He had a plan to escape. He pointed toward a certain direction and explained that there was a route through which it might be possible to get out. Jan was confused. Everywhere he looked, danger surrounded them. The freezing temperatures alone could kill them, and even if they somehow survived the cold, the civilians beyond the prison would hunt them down for the reward money placed on their heads. But John continued explaining in detail. They would have to wait until winter ended. When the temperature began to rise, even slightly, that would be their chance. It would still be brutally cold enough to kill them, but slightly more survivable than peak winter. If they could somehow make it to Mongolia, they might escape Soviet control entirely. However, the distance was enormous. It would take weeks of travel across frozen wilderness. For that journey, they would need to secretly gather warm clothing and store as much food as possible. Jan understood the seriousness of the plan. He wanted out. After only a short time inside this prison, he had already realized how merciless it was. There was no social life, no humanity, no proper way to live. It was slow death. From the next day onward, Jan and John began secretly collecting extra food and warm clothes. They hid their supplies carefully, where no one would notice. If the officers discovered even a hint of their preparation, both of them would be executed. John knew this risk well, but he did not fully explain the danger to Jan. Meanwhile, the daily routine continued. Prisoners were forced to perform hard labor, chopping wood, gathering coal, carrying heavy loads. One day, while a group of prisoners was being marched back after cutting timber, a violent snowstorm struck. The wind was so fierce that many could barely walk. The temperature dropped dangerously low. One prisoner collapsed and died on the spot. The conditions were so extreme that survival seemed impossible. Among them was an older man named Smith, the same man Jan had encountered earlier during the food incident. Smith had spent many years in this prison and understood the land better than most. He calmly suggested that they move into the forest. The trees would block some of the wind and reduce the effect of the storm. But the officer in charge refused. He pointed his gun at Smith and shouted that no one would enter the forest. He feared that once inside the trees, prisoners might attempt escape. However, Smith did not back down. He knew that if they stayed exposed in the open, they would freeze to death anyway. With nothing left to lose, he began walking toward the forest. The officer kept shouting, gun raised. But after a few moments, both officers and prisoners realized that Smith was right. The forest was the only chance of survival. Finally, the officers ordered everyone to follow him. Smith guided them through a path deep among the trees, where the wind was weaker. Hidden between thick trunks and branches, they managed to survive the storm. It was only because of Smith's experience that they made it back alive, but Smith had unknowingly signed his own punishment. When they returned to the prison, all the prisoners were lined up. A general arrived and was informed about the storm and how they had temporarily taken shelter in the forest. The general walked straight up to Smith and said coldly, "If you are so eager to run toward freedom, I will send you somewhere that will make you beg for death." He began selecting several prisoners as punishment, and John was among them. Jan had no idea where they were being sent, but Smith knew. It was a place even worse than the prison yard, a mining camp filled with deadly pollution and suffocating air. Soon, the selected prisoners were transferred to the mine. On the very first day, they were forced to break stones in toxic, dust-filled tunnels. The air was thick and suffocating. It was especially hard for Jan, who was new to this kind of labor. The pollution and lack of oxygen made him dizzy. He began hallucinating. Whenever he saw even the slightest glimmer of light, he would desperately try to move toward it, believing it was an exit. At one point, Jan began imagining that he was back home. In his mind, beneath a large rock, he could see the roof of his house. His thoughts blurred between reality and illusion as the brutal conditions slowly began breaking his mind. And this was only another chapter in the nightmare he had been sentenced to endure. Jan keeps hallucinating inside the mine. In his mind, he imagines that the key to his house is hidden beneath a stone. If he can just grab that key, he will be able to return home and live peacefully with his family again. But as he moves forward toward that illusion, reality strikes hard. A Soviet officer is standing right in front of him, pointing a gun directly at his chest, ready to shoot. At the last second, Smith rushes in from behind and pulls Jan back into the mine. Smith sternly warns him that acting like this will only get him killed. No one leaves the mine unless the officers allow it. Frustrated and emotionally broken, Yan tells Smith that he cannot live like this anymore. He wants to go home. But Smith coldly explains that this suffering is only the beginning. According to him, it would have been kinder if they had been shot immediately instead of being left to slowly die in such inhuman conditions. Yan then tells Smith about John's escape plan. However, Smith immediately rejects the idea. He says John is a liar. Years ago, when Smith first arrived at the prison, John had told him the same story and the same plan. According to Smith, the entire escape strategy is impossible. But after seeing Jan's desperation and his genuine longing to return to his family, Smith changes his mind. He decides to help Jan and even work with John to rebuild the plan properly. Jan is confused. Smith has always been a selfish man who cared only about his own survival. Why would he help now? Smith gives him a clear answer. He says he admired Jan's humanity. When Jan gave his food to the starving old man, he chose compassion over self-preservation. That selflessness earned Smith's respect. And now, in return, he is willing to stand beside him. However, they know the plan must be redesigned carefully. There can be no mistakes. If they are caught, it means immediate death by gunfire. From this moment onward, a deadly game begins. Slowly, their team grows to 7 men. Each of them is informed about the escape plan and begins secretly collecting resources for the journey. Among them is a hardened criminal and another man who is nearly blind at night. Some are newly arrived prisoners desperate to escape. After discussing every detail, they wait for the perfect opportunity. One night, a violent snowstorm strikes the prison. Freezing winds howl across the compound, and the temperature drops dangerously low. Jan realizes this is their best chance. If they escape during the storm, their footprints will be erased by the snow, making it impossible for officers to track them. Smith and the others agree. They gather their hidden supplies, shut down the generator to plunge the area into darkness, and quietly cut through the wires before slipping out of the prison. The storm is brutal. A single mistake could mean death. As the 7 men flee into the forest, a few officers spot them. The officers release trained tracking dogs to hunt them down. The storm prevents the soldiers from entering deep into the forest, but the dogs are enough. Running through thick snow is nearly impossible. Their legs sink deep with every step. Their exposed faces burn from the freezing wind. If they continue like this, they will freeze to death. Behind them, the dogs are closing in, following their scent. Jan understands that the dogs track them by smell. He quickly suggests turning their clothes inside out to reduce their scent. They also use foul-smelling materials and even body waste to confuse the dogs' tracking abilities. These small tactics may buy them time. Jan also notices that their uncovered faces are freezing rapidly. He breaks pieces of bark from trees and fashions makeshift masks for everyone. The masks help shield their faces from the brutal cold. Amazingly, the idea works. They push forward faster, determined to survive. Eventually, the storm weakens. The dogs and officers lose their trail somewhere in the forest. For the first time, the 7 fugitives are truly alone and temporarily safe. After hours of exhausting travel, they build a small shelter and examine their supplies. Even though they have gathered food and warm clothing, it becomes clear that it will not be enough. Their journey is long and extremely dangerous. Their bodies will need strength and proper nourishment. Still, they decide to keep moving forward together, promising equal contribution and loyalty. If one of them is captured, they all will suffer. Later, Smith questions Jan about bringing Chris along. Chris is a violent criminal who has committed multiple murders and even killed a man inside the prison. Jan explains that someone like Chris could be useful because he has weapons and survival skills that may help them later. As they move beyond the icy region, Chris suggests stopping near a village to steal food and supplies. But Jan refuses. Staying in one place too long increases the risk of being discovered. The group agrees to continue forward with whatever resources they have. Chris is clearly unhappy, but for now, he goes along with the decision. However, as the journey grows harsher, tension rises within the group, and soon, one of them will betray the others. They've been walking for hours, yet the storm refused to calm down. As night slowly fell, the temperature dropped even further. Jan knew that surviving the freezing darkness would be impossible without fire. He quickly told everyone that they needed to gather wood. If they wanted to stay alive, they would have to work together. The group scattered through the forest, each man searching for branches and dry sticks. What they did not realize was that one of the men was nearly blind at night. In the darkness, he lost his sense of direction while trying to help collect firewood. Only one criminal in the group knew about his condition. When the others finally gathered enough wood and managed to light a fire, they noticed one man was missing. As panic spread, the truth came out. He could not see in the dark. A tense moment followed. Some wanted to search for him immediately, but the freezing wind made it almost impossible to leave the warmth of the fire. In the end, they spent the entire night waiting. At sunrise, they finally found him sitting not far away, but it was too late. He had frozen to death. Silently, they buried him in the cold ground and continued their journey. One of the 7 was gone, and no one knew how many would survive the rest of the escape. After this tragedy, morale dropped. Still, Jan kept motivating the group. They needed to cross the border and reach Mongolia to escape Soviet control. As they moved forward, the snowy terrain slowly gave way to rocky landscapes. According to their plan, they were supposed to find a river as a landmark, but even after walking for another hour, there was no sign of it. Doubt began creeping in. Maybe they were lost. Maybe the plan itself was flawed. They camped for the night, and in the morning, strange animal sounds echoed nearby. Following the noise, they discovered wolves tearing apart a carcass. Without hesitation, the men chased the wolves away and began eating the raw meat. They had not eaten properly for days. Even uncooked, the meat gave them the strength they desperately needed. Overcome with guilt, Jan began blaming himself. He felt he had dragged everyone into this suffering. Deciding to take responsibility, he announced that he would go ahead alone to search for the river. If he did not return within a few days, they should assume he had died. The others tried to stop him, but Jan set off alone. The journey was brutal. He faced freezing winds and severe exhaustion without proper food or water. At one point, weakness caused him to hallucinate again. He imagined his home standing before him, but reality struck once more. Days later, somehow still alive, Jan finally returned to the group. He told them the river lay to the south. Moments after delivering the news, he collapsed. The others cared for him through the night, and by morning he regained some strength. With renewed hope, they moved south. While traveling through the forest, they sensed someone following them. Soon, they discovered a young woman hiding nearby. She was also fleeing from officers and begged to join them. At first, the group refused. Adding another person meant sharing their already limited resources. But when they later found an animal trapped in mud near the river, they killed it for food. Realizing they now had enough meat for several days, one of the men went back and brought the woman to join them. Now they were 7 again. After reaching what they believed was the border, they noticed large pillars displaying photographs of Soviet officers from the prison. This meant Soviet influence extended here as well. The border was not safe. Disappointed, but not defeated, Jan and Smith decided they would continue toward China and eventually deeper into Asia, where forests might provide shelter and freedom. But before that, they had to cross mountain ranges and a vast desert, perhaps their greatest test yet. The desert was merciless. The heat was unbearable, their feet swollen, their bodies weak. They had not drunk water for hours. Turning back was not an option. It meant certain death. Jan encouraged them by saying that beyond the desert, mountains might offer food and water. The young woman grew weaker each day. Her feet were badly swollen, and she could barely walk. At one point, they saw what looked like water in the distance. Jan warned it could be a mirage, but the group insisted on checking. To their relief, it was real, a small pond. They rushed to drink and refilled their containers. However, the desert had already taken too much from them. The girl's body could not endure the heat any longer. She collapsed and died. With heavy hearts, they buried her respectfully and continued forward. They had eaten almost nothing, surviving only on small amounts of water, and still, more trials awaited them in the endless desert ahead. As they continued through the desert, new dangers kept appearing. Sometimes they had to face sudden sandstorms, and other times someone would nearly get trapped in mud. Tragically, another man lost his life along the way. Now only a few of them were left to continue the journey. After hours of struggling forward, they finally saw mountain ranges in the distance. The desert was coming to an end, but reaching the rocky terrain did not mean relief. By the time they climbed up into the hills, everyone collapsed from exhaustion. They barely had the strength to stand. Smith, in particular, was on the verge of death. At that moment, one of the men spotted a snake slithering nearby and immediately ran after it. Fortunately, they also discovered a small water source. Everyone rushed to drink. The snake was killed, its head cut off, and they cooked and ate what they could. It wasn't much, but it gave their bodies just enough energy to survive another night. That night, Jan spoke softly with Smith. He told him that no matter what had happened, he still wanted to reunite with his wife. Even if the officers had forced her to testify against him, he did not blame her. He knew she must have been pressured. By morning, they moved toward China. But they could not stay there either, as war was raging across the country. Beyond that lay another icy mountain region. After crossing it, they encountered a tribal community who welcomed them warmly. The tribe provided food and shelter, offering them a chance to finally rest. However, Jan insisted that he had to keep moving. Smith decided he would stay there and wait before going any further. So Jan continued forward with the remaining companions, eventually reaching a remote part of Asia where no formal government had yet been established. For the first time, they were truly safe. Years later, Jan's homeland was finally freed from Soviet control. The oppressive regime was gone. There were no more tyrannical officers ruling over the people. When he learned this, Jan returned home to find his wife. The moment felt like one of his old hallucinations, standing before a door, holding a key. But this time, it was real. Now an old man, he slowly unlocked the door. On the other side stood his wife, aged but alive. After so many years of separation, they were finally reunited. They embraced, deciding to spend the rest of their lives together. And with that emotional reunion, this powerful and heartbreaking story comes to an end. So friends, that was the full story. Now tell me in the comments, how was your experience watching this journey? Which moment touched you the most? If you felt even a little bit of the pain, struggle, and hope in this story, then let's set a target of 1,000 likes on this video. Hit the like button right now and help us reach that goal. Don't forget to share this video with your friends so they can experience this incredible story too. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because many more powerful and mind-blowing stories are coming your way. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.